No hate here, only passion and drama of the game. This story will keep you on the edge of your seat, made just for you. Drop where you're watching from in the comments, hit like, and subscribe for the twist. The rain poured in relentless sheets, cascading off the edge of the dilapidated awning where Darnell huddled, his coat soaked through and a faint shiver betraying the cold he was trying to ignore. Across the street, the screech of tires pierced the air as a sleek silver car skidded onto the curb, its driver tumbling out in a flurry of panic. Darnell's sharp eyes caught the figure, an older white man, his face pale and twisted in pain as he clutched his chest. The man staggered, dropping to his knees in the downpour, his mouth forming silent cries for help. Passers-by froze, their umbrellas useless against the drama unfolding. No one moved, except Darnell. He pulled his hood tighter, his footsteps quick but deliberate as he crossed the slick pavement. The man's suit was pristine even as it soaked in rainwater, his gold watch glinting under the streetlights. Darnell hesitated for the briefest of moments, the man's face striking a faint chord of familiarity. But this wasn't the time to dwell on it. "Sir, can you hear me?" Darnell asked, his voice calm but urgent as he crouched beside him. The man opened his eyes, blinking furiously against the rain, and for a moment his gaze hardened. His lips trembled, not just from the cold, but from something deeper: disdain, discomfort. "What are you doing here?" he gasped between shallow breaths. "I'm helping you," Darnell replied, ignoring the edge in the man's tone. He placed a steady hand on his shoulder, checking his pulse with the other. "You're having a heart attack. We need to get you help now." The man tried to push Darnell's hand away weakly, his pride wrestling with his failing body. "Don't need your help," he whispered, but his defiance crumbled with the weight of his pain. "You don't have a choice," Darnell said firmly, flagging down a taxi with a quick wave. The tension in the cramped back seat was palpable as the cab sped through the city, splashing through puddles. The man's breathing was shallow, and his eyes flitted nervously between Darnell and the driver. Darnell stayed focused, pressing a cloth against the man's sweat-drenched forehead. "Why are you doing this?" the man muttered, his voice weaker now. Darnell hesitated. He could hear the unspoken accusation behind the question, the disbelief that someone like him, a homeless man in ragged clothes, would care enough to help. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply, staring out at the blur of city lights. The man let out a faint, bitter laugh that turned into a cough. "Funny, coming from you." Darnell ignored the jab, his eyes narrowing as the hospital loomed in the distance. "Just hold on," he said, his tone unyielding. As the doctors wheeled the man away, Darnell leaned against the wall of the emergency room, his clothes soaked and his hands trembling slightly. He wasn't sure what made him stop to help. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was something else. His stomach growled, a stark reminder of his own struggles. He considered leaving but paused when he heard hurried footsteps approaching. "Sir, wait," came a nurse's voice. Darnell turned, and for the first time, he realized the man's name, Dr. Henry Wallace, was emblazoned on the patient intake form the nurse held. The name struck him like a thunderbolt. He had heard of Henry Wallace, the renowned surgeon with a reputation for skill matched only by his arrogance. And now, Henry Wallace owed his life to a man he wouldn't have given a second glance to on the street. As Darnell stepped back into the rain, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. Wallace's face stayed with him, not just the pain, but the fleeting glimpse of vulnerability. Little did either man know, their paths were far from done crossing, and somewhere in the depths of the hospital, Henry Wallace stared at the ceiling, haunted by the face of the man who had saved him. Darnell walked into the wet night, his shoes squelching against the rain-soaked pavement. The hospital's bright lights faded into the background, but his thoughts were anything but dim. The face of Dr. Henry Wallace lingered in his mind, not because of the man's pain or pride, but because of the unmistakable bitterness in his eyes, the kind of disdain Darnell had seen far too often. He pulled his tattered coat tighter around himself and ducked into an alley, seeking the makeshift shelter he'd claimed for the night. His stomach growled again, louder this time, reminding him of the sandwich he'd skipped earlier to stretch what little money he had left. The thought of Wallace, A man who probably didn't think twice about the cost of a meal made his jaw tighten, but Darnell had no room for resentment. He'd done the right thing, and that was enough, for now. Across town, Henry Wallace lay in a sterile hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. His chest ached, but not from the heart attack. It was the memory of those eyes, the way they looked at him, not with pity, but with resolve. He had felt helpless, vulnerable in a way he hadn't been since his childhood, and that man, Darnell, had been the one to see him in that state. Dr. Wallace. A nurse's voice interrupted his thoughts. Your son is here. Henry's expression softened, a flicker of relief washing over him. The door opened, and a young man in his early 20s stepped in, his face a mirror of his father's, but without the hardened edges. Dad, what happened? His son, Patrick asked, his voice tight with concern. Nothing, Henry said gruffly, though his voice faltered. Just stress. Stress doesn't land you in the hospital, Patrick replied, his tone sharper now. You scared me. Henry waved him off, but his hand trembled slightly. Patrick noticed and stepped closer, his worry deepening. Who was the guy who brought you here? The nurse said he didn't even stick around. Henry stiffened. He didn't want to talk about Darnell, much less acknowledge the man who had seen him at his weakest. Just someone passing by, he muttered, avoiding his son's gaze. Patrick frowned but didn't push further. Instead, he glanced at the clock on the wall. Look, I've got class early tomorrow, but I'll check on you first thing in the morning. Henry nodded, his relief palpable as his son left. Alone again, his thoughts returned to the alley, the rain, and Darnell. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the man than met the eye. The next morning, as Henry was discharged, he couldn't stop himself from asking the nurse a question that had been gnawing at him. The man who brought me in, did he give a name? Anything? The nurse shook her head. No, but he stayed until the doctors got you stabilized. He didn't even ask for a thank you. Henry's mouth set into a grim line. It didn't sit right with him, but he pushed the thought aside. He had patients to see, surgeries to plan, work that didn't allow for distractions. Meanwhile, Darnell's day started with a harsh dose of reality. The small stash of cash he had hidden under his mattress was gone, stolen in the night. His belongings were scattered across the alley, his only spare shirt torn and tossed in the mud. Darnell clenched his fists, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He felt the familiar sting of anger rising, but there was no time to dwell on it. He had to find work, any work, to keep himself afloat. As he wandered the city, the name Henry Wallace flashed across a billboard near the hospital. It was an advertisement for a charity gala supporting medical research, featuring the celebrated Dr. Wallace as the keynote speaker. Darnell paused, his eyes narrowing. The man who had so much, who had everything, was being lauded as a savior while Darnell scraped by with nothing. The unfairness of it all weighed heavily on him, but deep down, he couldn't bring himself to hate Wallace, not after what he'd seen in his eyes that night. What Darnell didn't know was that their paths were destined to cross again, in ways neither of them could have foreseen. As the sun began its slow descent, casting the city in hues of orange and pink, Darnell found himself sitting on the edge of a public fountain in the park. The remnants of the afternoon's chaos still clung to him. His stolen belongings, his exhaustion, and the lingering memory of Dr. Wallace. He dipped his hands into the cool water and splashed his face, hoping to clear his head. Across town, Dr. Wallace was walking through the hospital corridors, feeling the familiar weight of routine settle on his shoulders. But something gnawed at him, an unease that had been present since his encounter with Darnell. The man's quiet resolve, his selflessness, lingered in Wallace's mind. Wallace stepped into his office, where his assistant handed him a folder. Dr. Wallace, here's the rundown for tonight's gala. Your speech is at 8:30, followed by the auction. Thank you, he said, absent-mindedly thumbing through the papers. The gala. Yet another obligation, another performance. He sighed, closing the folder. Darnell, meanwhile, was growing desperate. He'd spent hours roaming the city, looking for day labor or any opportunity to earn a little money. But rejection after rejection had left him drained. As he passed a cafe, the The smell of fresh bread made his stomach tighten painfully. "Hey!" a voice called out. Darnell turned to see an older man standing by the cafe's back door, wiping his hands on an apron. "You looking for work?" "Yes, sir," Darnell said quickly. The man studied him for a moment before jerking his head toward the door. "We need someone to unload a shipment in the back." "It's not much, but it's something." Relief washed over Darnell. "Thank you. I'll get started right away." As he worked, hauling crates and stacking boxes, he overheard the cafe staff talking about the charity gala. "Dr. Wallace is the guest of honor," one of the waitresses said. "They're expecting a big turnout." Darnell froze, the weight of a crate pressing into his arms. Wallace. The name stirred something in him, a mix of resentment, curiosity, and something he couldn't quite place. That evening, the charity gala was in full swing. The room buzzed with energy as guests mingled, sipping champagne and discussing the hospital's latest advancements. Dr. Wallace, dressed in a tailored suit, stood near the stage, his practiced smile masking the restlessness he felt inside. As the speeches began, Wallace found himself zoning out, his thoughts drifting back to the man who had saved him. For the first time in years, he questioned the image he'd carefully cultivated. The esteemed doctor, the charitable figure. Had it all been a facade? "Dr. Wallace, you're up," a voice interrupted his thoughts. He stepped onto the stage, the applause ringing in his ears. But as he began his speech, something in the room caught his attention. A figure near the back, standing apart from the crowd. It was Darnell. Darnell's presence was like a shockwave. Wallace faltered for a moment, his polished words slipping away. Why was he here? How had he even gotten in? But as their eyes met across the room, Wallace realized something else. Darnell wasn't there to confront him, to seek gratitude or revenge. He was simply watching, his expression unreadable. Darnell didn't move from his spot, standing just beyond the lavishly decorated crowd. He was out of place among the glittering gowns and tailored suits, but his quiet composure gave him an almost magnetic presence. Guests cast glances in his direction, whispering among themselves. Wallace's speech faltered again, but he forced himself to continue, his usual confidence slipping. The polished words of gratitude and progress came out hollow. His mind was stuck on Darnell, on the man who had risked his safety for him without hesitation. As the applause concluded and Wallace stepped off the stage, his heart pounded in his chest. The gala resumed its usual rhythm, waiters weaving through the crowd with trays of champagne, but the room seemed smaller, the air heavier. Wallace couldn't shake the feeling that his past actions, the years of dismissing people like Darnell, were coming back to confront him. Darnell stayed rooted in place, his expression unreadable, his gaze steady. Wallace couldn't avoid him any longer. With a tight jaw and a forced air of confidence, he weaved through the crowd toward the man who now seemed larger than life. "Darnell," Wallace said, his voice low and measured as he approached. Darnell's eyes flicked to his, calm but unyielding. "Doctor." The simple word carried weight, a reminder of their encounter earlier that day and the unspoken tension between them. "What are you doing here?" Wallace asked, his tone not unkind, but laced with unease. Darnell gestured toward the room. "I figured I'd see how the other half lives. Looks nice. Fancy." He paused, his gaze scanning the room before landing back on Wallace. "Didn't think I'd run into you again so soon." Wallace shifted uncomfortably. "This isn't really the place for someone like me?" Darnell interrupted, his voice even but sharp enough to cut through Wallace's words. The doctor froze, caught in the truth of Darnell's question. "No," Wallace said finally, his voice quieter. "I didn't mean it like that." Darnell tilted his head, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe not, but it's what you were thinking." The weight of the moment settled between them, drawing curious glances from nearby guests. Wallace ignored them, his focus solely on the man in front of him. "Why are you here, Darnell?" Wallace asked again, his voice softer this time. Darnell looked past him, his eyes distant. "I didn't come to make a scene, if that's what you're worried about. I just wanted to see something." "See what?" Wallace pressed. Darnell's gaze shifted back to him, piercing and direct. If you're the man people in this room think you are, the one they clap for, the one they trust with their lives, Wallace felt his chest tighten. He opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss. I saved you today, Darnell continued, his voice steady but charged with meaning. Not because I wanted anything from you, but because it was the right thing to do. Now I'm just trying to figure out if you'd have done the same for me. The words hit Wallace like a blow, forcing him to confront a truth he wasn't ready to face. Before he could respond, a commotion erupted near the entrance. A waiter, carrying a tray of glasses, tripped, sending shards of glass and champagne scattering across the floor. The noise drew everyone's attention, and for a brief moment, Wallace turned to see what had happened. When he turned back, Darnell was gone. Wallace scanned the room, his heart pounding. He felt a strange sense of urgency, as though letting Darnell leave without answering his unspoken question would be a mistake he couldn't undo. He pushed through the crowd toward the exit, his mind racing. Outside, the cool night air hit him like a slap. The city buzzed with life, cars honking and distant music filling the streets. Wallace's eyes darted left and right, searching for any sign of Darnell. There, down the block, he spotted him. Darnell was walking away, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his silhouette blending into the shadows. Darnell, Wallace called out, his voice cutting through the noise. Darnell paused but didn't turn around. Wallace jogged to catch up, his breaths quick and uneven. Wait, Wallace said as he reached him. Don't just walk away. Darnell stopped but didn't face him. What do you want, Doctor? I don't know. I want to understand, Wallace admitted, his voice tinged with frustration and something close to desperation. Why did you save me? Darnell finally turned, his expression unreadable. Because someone has to break the cycle, he said simply. Even if it's not you. Wallace stood there, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't yet untangle. He realized, for the first time in a long time, that he didn't have all the answers. And for the first time, he wanted to find them. Wallace stood frozen in the middle of the bustling sidewalk as Darnell's words settled heavily in his chest. Because someone has to break the cycle. Even if it's not you, those words clung to him, sharp and unrelenting, forcing him to confront the weight of his actions, or lack thereof, over the years. Darnell, Wallace called again, his voice softer now, almost pleading. But Darnell was already moving, his figure disappearing into the labyrinth of city streets. Wallace's instinct was to follow, but he hesitated. Something about the man's calm yet firm demeanor told him that Darnell wasn't seeking an audience, let alone an apology. Still, an unfamiliar sense of urgency gripped Wallace, as if letting this moment slip away would solidify his role in a narrative he no longer wanted to be part of. Wallace ran a hand over his face, the polished exterior he carried so well in the hospital or at galas beginning to crack. His heart raced, his breath uneven. The noises of the city seemed distant as his thoughts drowned out the world around him. He turned back toward the gala, the warm light spilling onto the sidewalk almost mocking him. Inside, the celebration continued. The room was filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of polite conversation. But Wallace couldn't focus on any of it. He grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing tray and downed it in one gulp, but the liquid burned in his throat, doing little to dull the unease gnawing at him. As he set the empty glass on a nearby table, a woman's voice broke through his thoughts. Wallace, are you all right? It was Elizabeth, one of the hospital board members, her expression one of polite concern. He forced a smile. Just a lot on my mind. Tonight's a big deal, she said, her tone light. You've done incredible work. The community looks up to you, you know. Wallace nodded absently, her words ringing hollow. Thanks, Elizabeth. But her voice faded as his thoughts returned to Darnell. Wallace excused himself, weaving through the crowd until he reached the back of the room. He pulled out his phone and stared at the screen. He had no idea where Darnell lived, no way to contact him. He felt helpless in a way that was deeply unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable. As he stood there, his thoughts were interrupted by another commotion. This time, it wasn't a drop tray or an accident. It was raised voices. Wallace's head snapped toward the source of the noise near the entrance. A man, scruffy, his clothes worn and dirty, was being ushered out by security. The man shouted something unintelligible as he was dragged toward the doors, his voice full of anger and desperation. Without thinking, Wallace moved toward the scene. The security guards, clearly irritated, were trying to maintain order while the man flailed against their grip. "Let him go," Wallace said sharply, his authoritative tone cutting through the chaos. The guards hesitated. "Dr. Wallace, this man was causing a disturbance." "I said let him go," Wallace repeated, his voice steady but firm. Reluctantly, the guards released the man, who stumbled forward, his eyes darting around nervously. Wallace approached him cautiously. "Are you all right?" Wallace asked, his voice softer now. The man looked at him warily, as if trying to decide whether Wallace was an ally or another obstacle. I wasn't trying to cause trouble. I just needed." "What do you need?" Wallace asked, his tone genuine. The man hesitated before gesturing toward the back of the room. "I just wanted to talk to someone about getting help, but they threw me out before I could." Wallace felt a pang of guilt. He thought of Darnell, of his words about breaking the cycle. "Come with me," Wallace said, leading the man toward a quieter corner of the room. The man introduced himself as Jake, explaining how he'd been living on the streets for months after losing his job and home. His story wasn't unique. Wallace had heard similar tales before, but tonight, it hit differently. As Jake spoke, Wallace realized how many people like him he'd dismissed over the years. He'd always rationalized it, telling himself he was too busy or that it wasn't his responsibility. But now, the excuses felt hollow. Jake's voice cracked as he finished his story. I just need someone to give me a chance." Wallace swallowed hard, his mind racing. He didn't have an immediate solution for Jake's problems, but he knew he couldn't turn him away. "I'll see what I can do," Wallace said finally. Jake looked at him, his expression a mix of hope and skepticism. "You mean it?" Wallace nodded. "I mean it." As Jake left, a strange feeling settled over Wallace. It wasn't satisfaction or relief. It was something heavier, something unresolved. He thought of Darnell again, of his quiet strength and the unspoken challenge he'd left behind. Wallace wasn't sure what he'd do next, but he knew he couldn't go back to who he was before. And somewhere, deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Wallace stepped outside into the cool night air, his mind restless and heavy. The weight of Jake's story and Darnell's piercing words felt like chains pulling him down. The once welcoming glow of the gala behind him now seemed suffocating, a reminder of the life he'd meticulously built, a life that suddenly felt hollow. He stood on the steps of the grand building, staring out into the bustling city, the hum of distant traffic filling the void. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from his assistant reminding him of an early morning meeting with the hospital board. Normally, such messages would fill him with a sense of accomplishment, a reminder of his status and achievements. But tonight, it felt like another shackle, another reminder of how far removed he had become from the very people he claimed to help. As Wallace slipped his phone back into his pocket, his gaze fell on the street corner. A figure caught his eye, a man huddled against a building wall, wrapped in a thin, tattered blanket. It wasn't Darnell, but the sight of the man, alone and vulnerable, struck a chord deep within him. Wallace clenched his jaw and began walking, his steps purposeful but his thoughts scattered. He didn't know where he was going, but his feet carried him away from the gala, away from the grand facade of success, and into the heart of the city. The streets grew darker, quieter, and the people he passed looked less polished, their faces marked by fatigue and survival. It was a part of the city he rarely ventured into, a world that existed parallel to his own but felt miles apart. As he rounded a corner, a faint voice called out, "Hey, Doc." Wallace turned sharply, his heart racing. Standing in the shadows was Darnell, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his weathered coat. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held the same quiet intensity that had unnerved Wallace earlier. "Darnell," Wallace said, his voice tinged with a mix of relief and apprehension. "I've been looking for you." Darnell smirked faintly. "Didn't think you were the type to wander down here. What's the occasion?" Wallace hesitated, unsure how to respond. I needed to talk to you. About what you said earlier. Darnell raised an eyebrow. What part? The part where I said someone has to break the cycle. Or the part where I walked away because I knew you wouldn't? Wallace felt a pang of shame, but forced himself to hold Darnell's gaze. Both. You were right. I've spent my life looking the other way, telling myself it wasn't my problem. But tonight I realized I can't keep doing that. Darnell studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. So what are you going to do about it, Doc? Throw some money at a charity? Write a check and call it a day? No, Wallace said firmly. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do yet, but I want to start somewhere. I want to listen. To understand. Darnell's smirk faded, replaced by a look of cautious curiosity. You serious? I am, Wallace said, his voice steady. But I need your help. Darnell laughed softly, the sound tinged with disbelief. You want my help? The homeless guy you barely looked at twice earlier tonight? Wallace nodded. You see things I don't. You've lived experiences I can't even begin to understand. If I'm going to make a real difference, I need someone to show me what I've been missing. Darnell was silent for a moment, his gaze piercing. Then he shook his head with a rueful smile. You're either crazy or desperate. Maybe both. Maybe, Wallace admitted. But I'm willing to learn. Darnell sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. All right, document. If you're serious, meet me here tomorrow night. Same time. But don't show up in your fancy suit or driving your luxury car. Come as a person, not a title. Wallace nodded, his heart pounding. I'll be here. Darnell gave him one last long look before turning and disappearing into the shadows. Wallace stood there for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling over him. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was stepping toward something real, something meaningful. As he made his way back to his car, the city seemed different, grittier, yes, but also alive with possibilities. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. The stakes were rising, and so was his determination. The following evening, Wallace stood at the same corner, the chilly wind biting through his jacket. This time, he wasn't in his tailored suit. Instead, he wore a simple sweater and jeans, clothes that felt foreign to him but somehow fitting for the setting. He had parked his car blocks away and walked here, carrying only a small backpack with a water bottle, notebook, and some essentials. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he was determined to follow through. The streets were quieter tonight, the hum of distant traffic barely audible. Wallace glanced around, looking for Darnell. The shadows felt heavier now, the dim streetlights casting long, eerie shapes on the cracked pavement. His heart pounded in his chest as he waited, the seconds stretching into what felt like hours. Then, from the darkness, Darnell emerged, his silhouette sharp against the glow of a nearby streetlight. He moved with a certain ease, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, his eyes scanning the area before settling on Wallace. He gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. Didn't think you'd show, Darnell said, his voice carrying a mix of skepticism and faint surprise. I said I would, Wallace replied, trying to steady his voice. I'm here. Darnell studied him for a moment, then motioned for him to follow. Come on. You wanted to see what it's like? Let's go. They walked side by side, the silence between them heavy but not entirely uncomfortable. Wallace tried to take in his surroundings, noticing details he had overlooked the night before. The faded graffiti on the walls, the faint scent of garbage lingering in the air, the quiet murmur of distant conversations from alleyways. After several blocks, Darnell led Wallace to a small park. It was poorly lit, the benches worn and rusted. A few people were scattered around, some huddled under blankets, others sitting in quiet conversation. Darnell gestured toward a bench near the edge of the park, and they sat down. This, Darnell said, motioning to the park, is home for a lot of us. At least for now. Wallace looked around, his chest tightening. He had driven past parks like this countless times, never giving a second thought to the people inside. Now, sitting here, he felt a strange mix of guilt and curiosity. What happened? Wallace asked softly. How did you end up here? Darnell leaned back on the bench, his eyes fixed on the distant city lights. Lost my job first. Then my apartment. One thing led to another, and here I am. He shrugged, his tone casual, but there was an edge to his words, a bitterness that Wallace couldn't ignore. And no one helped you? Wallace pressed. Darnell shot him a look, his lips curving into a faint smirk. Help? People like you walk by every day, pretending not to see us. The only help I got was from others in the same boat. That's how it works down here. We take care of our own. Wallace felt a pang of shame but didn't look away. I want to change that, he said quietly. Darnell let out a dry laugh. Words are cheap. Document. You want to help? Then stop talking and start doing. Before Wallace could respond, a sudden commotion broke out on the other side of the park. Two men were arguing loudly, their voices carrying across the still night. One of them, a tall, wiry man, stepped closer to the other, his movements aggressive. Stay here, Darnell said sharply. Standing up, what are you going to do? Wallace asked, alarmed. Calm them down, Darnell replied, his tone firm. Just sit tight. Wallace watched as Darnell approached the men, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. The tension in the air was palpable, every muscle in Wallace's body on edge. He couldn't hear what Darnell was saying, but his body language was calm, measured. The argument seemed to de-escalate slightly, but the wiry man suddenly shoved Darnell, sending him stumbling back. Instinctively, Wallace stood, his heart racing. He wanted to intervene, but he didn't know how. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more futile than the last. Darnell recovered quickly, holding his ground. His voice grew firmer, though Wallace still couldn't make out the words. The confrontation continued, the tension thickening with every passing second. Wallace could only watch, his fists clenched, as the scene unfolded before him. This was a world he didn't understand, a world where words and intentions weren't enough. And for the first time in his life, Wallace felt truly powerless. The stakes were rising, and he was only beginning to grasp just how far he would have to go to make a difference. Darnell's voice remained calm, but there was a sharp edge of authority in it now. He took a step closer to the wiry man, ignoring the lingering threat in the man's body language. Wallace could only hear snippets of their exchange. Words like respect, community, and don't make it worse echoed faintly. Darnell was standing his ground, but Wallace could see the strain on his face. The wiry man jabbed a finger at Darnell's chest, shouting something inaudible. People in the park were starting to take notice, their heads turning toward the confrontation. A few began to stand, inching closer, ready to intervene if needed. Wallace's pulse quickened. He felt out of place, a stranger in a world where survival meant understanding the unspoken rules. Wallace's mind screamed at him to act, to do something. But what? He didn't belong here, didn't know how to navigate this delicate balance of tension and pride. The last thing he wanted was to escalate the situation by stepping in without understanding it. So he stayed rooted to the bench, his hands trembling slightly as he watched. Then it happened. The wiry man lunged, grabbing Darnell by the collar. Wallace shot up instinctively, his heart pounding in his ears. The men struggled for a moment before Darnell managed to twist out of the man's grip. His movements were sharp, calculated. Clearly not the first time he'd had to defend himself. Back off, Darnell's voice boomed, louder now, filled with a commanding force that silenced the small crowd gathering around them. The wiry man hesitated, his eyes darting to the onlookers. His bravado faltered, replaced by an uncertain wariness. Go home, Darnell said, his tone cold and unyielding. We've got enough problems without you adding to them. The wiry man spat on the ground, his defiance giving way to a begrudging retreat. He threw one last glare at Darnell before storming off into the shadows. The crowd began to disperse, muttering quietly among themselves as the tension slowly ebbed away. Darnell exhaled deeply, rubbing the back of his neck as he turned back toward Wallace. You okay? Wallace asked, his voice shaky. Yeah, Darnell muttered, his tone curt. This happens. People get desperate, and desperation makes them stupid. Wallace hesitated, unsure of what to say. He looked at Darnell, really looked at him and saw the weight this man carried. Years of struggle etched into the lines of his face, the quiet exhaustion in his eyes. Yet there was resilience too, a strength Wallace couldn't begin to comprehend. "Why do you stay?" Wallace finally asked. "Why not leave, try to start fresh somewhere else?" Darnell gave a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. "You think it's that easy? There's no fresh start when the system's stacked against you. Out here, we've got each other. It's messy, sure, but it's all we've got." Wallace opened his mouth to respond but was cut off by the sudden wail of sirens in the distance. The sound sent a ripple of unease through the park. People froze, their eyes darting toward the source of the noise. "Cops," Darnell said under his breath. His jaw tightened as he looked around. "They're probably making a sweep. What do we do?" Wallace asked, panic creeping into his voice. "Stick with me," Darnell replied. "And keep quiet." The two men moved quickly but calmly, blending into the shifting crowd as people began to disperse. Wallace felt the adrenaline surging through him, every nerve on edge. He never felt so out of place, so exposed. As they ducked into an alleyway, Darnell led him through a maze of narrow streets and hidden passages, the sounds of the sirens growing fainter. Wallace's heart raced, his thoughts spiraling. This was more than he'd bargained for. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was exactly where he needed to be. When they finally stopped, Darnell leaned against a brick wall, breathing heavily. Wallace could see the tension in his posture, the way his hands clenched and unclenched as if trying to release the stress that had built up. "Is this what it's always like?" Wallace asked quietly. Darnell glanced at him, his expression hard to read. "Pretty much. You wanted to understand? This is it. The fear, the fights, the running. It's all part of the package." Wallace didn't respond. He didn't know how to. Instead, he leaned back against the wall, staring up at the sliver of night sky visible between the buildings. For the first time, he felt the enormity of the world outside his own privileged bubble, a world he barely understood but was now determined to learn about. As the silence stretched between them, Darnell finally spoke. "You've got a lot to learn, document. But if you're serious about helping, then stick around. It's gonna get harder before it gets better." Wallace nodded, his resolve hardening. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was ready to face it, no matter how messy, dangerous, or uncomfortable it got. He was all in now. The faint sounds of sirens still lingered in the air, mixing with the occasional hum of distant traffic. Darnell pushed off the wall and motioned for Wallace to follow him. Without a word, they began weaving through the labyrinth of backstreets, the moonlight barely illuminating their path. Wallace's nerves were on edge, each step echoing faintly in the narrow alleys. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just an excursion into another world. It was survival, raw and unfiltered. Darnell stopped suddenly at the mouth of a narrow alley. He held up a hand, signaling Wallace to stay back. Peering around the corner, Darnell's expression darkened. Wallace crept closer, his breath shallow, and looked over Darnell's shoulder. Two police cars were parked at the end of the street, their red and blue lights bouncing off the buildings. Officers were questioning a small group of people near a rundown corner store. The tension in the air was palpable. "Stay out of sight," Darnell whispered, his voice low and firm. "We don't need their attention." Wallace nodded, his stomach twisting. He'd never had to think about being targeted or harassed by the police before. The idea that simply existing in this neighborhood could make someone a suspect was a stark contrast to the life he knew. As they crouched in the shadows, he noticed Darnell's posture, rigid, alert, like a coiled spring ready to snap. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Wallace could hear snippets of the officers' voices, their questions growing sharper, more accusatory. The group being questioned shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting toward the police cars. Darnell's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. Wallace wanted to ask what they were waiting for, but the tension in Darnell's demeanor kept him silent. Finally, one of the officers waved the group off, and they dispersed quickly, heads down and shoulders hunched. The officers lingered for a moment longer, scanning the street before climbing back into their cars. The vehicles pulled away slowly, the flashing lights fading into the distance. Only then did Darnell exhale, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Let's move," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They continued through the maze of alleys, eventually emerging onto a quieter street, lined with boarded-up storefronts and graffiti-covered walls. Darnell led Wallace to a dimly lit doorway, tapping a specific pattern on the metal door. It creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that led to an underground space. Inside, the room buzzed with quiet activity. A handful of people huddled around makeshift tables, sorting through donated supplies, canned food, clothing, medical kits. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and faint traces of cleaning solution. Despite the somber atmosphere, there was an undeniable sense of purpose. These people weren't just surviving. They were supporting each other, building something from the scraps life had handed them. Darnell introduced Wallace briefly, his tone neutral. Some nodded in acknowledgement, while others gave wary glances. Wallace felt out of place, an outsider in a community bound by shared struggles he could barely comprehend. But he also felt a strange pull, a desire to prove himself, to show he wasn't just another well-meaning stranger who would disappear when things got hard. As Darnell stepped aside to speak with a woman organizing the supplies, Wallace wandered through the room, observing. He noticed a young boy, no older than 10, sitting in the corner with a sketch pad, drawing furiously. The boy's brow was furrowed in concentration, his small hands moving with precision. Wallace crouched down, trying to get a better look without startling him. "That's a good drawing," he said softly. The boy glanced up, his eyes cautious but curious. "It's a superhero," he muttered. "He saves people." Wallace smiled. "What's his name?" The boy hesitated before answering. "Haven't decided yet. He doesn't have a name until he finishes saving everyone." Wallace's heart ached at the simplicity and weight of the boy's words. It was a stark reminder of how much hope this community needed, how even the youngest among them carried the burden of dreaming about salvation. Before he could respond, Darnell called his name. Wallace stood and joined him near one of the tables, where the woman Darnell had been speaking to was now eyeing him critically. "You said he's here to help," she said to Darnell, her tone skeptical. "He is," Darnell replied firmly. "Just give him a chance." The woman studied Wallace for a moment longer before turning her attention back to Darnell. "We've got enough for the food run tomorrow, but we're short on first aid supplies. We'll need someone to cover the east side too. It's getting worse over there." Darnell nodded, his expression serious. "I'll handle it. Wallace can come with me." The woman raised an eyebrow. "You sure that's a good idea? He doesn't look like he's built for this." Wallace felt a flash of embarrassment, but forced himself to speak up. "I can handle it," he said, trying to sound confident. "Just tell me what to do." Darnell clapped him on the shoulder. "We'll see." As the night stretched on, Wallace found himself more entangled in this hidden world, each moment raising more questions than answers. What dangers awaited on the east side? How much deeper would he have to go to truly make a difference? And what price would he have to pay to earn this community's trust? The weight of those questions hung heavily in the air, the answers just out of reach. The morning came with a gray, overcast sky, and the air carried a damp chill that seemed to seep into Wallace's bones as he followed Darnell through the streets. The city looked different in the early light, more desolate, as if it had given up on pretending to be alive. The usual hum of traffic and faint chatter of passers-by were replaced by an eerie quiet that made Wallace hyper-aware of every sound. The crunch of their footsteps, the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe, and the distant bark of a dog. Darnell's pace was brisk, his eyes scanning their surroundings constantly. Wallace struggled to keep up, the weight of a backpack filled with supplies pulling on his shoulders. Inside were bandages, antiseptic, and other first aid items meant for the east side, an area Darnell had only described as bad news. "Stick close," Darnell warned as they turned a corner into a part of the city Wallace didn't recognize. The buildings here seemed more decayed, their facades crumbling and windows shattered. Graffiti covered every surface, some of it artistic, some just angry scrawls. A few people lingered on the sidewalks, their expressions wary as they watched the two men pass. Wallace felt their eyes on him, each glance a mixture of suspicion and hostility. He lowered his gaze, trying to appear unassuming, but the tension was palpable. He wondered how Darnell could walk so confidently, as if he belonged in every corner of this city. As they approached an old community center with boarded-up windows, Darnell stopped abruptly and held up a hand. Wallace froze, his heart racing as he followed Darnell's gaze. Across the street, a group of men stood clustered near a car, their voices low but heated. They looked rough, muscles straining against worn jackets, tattoos snaking up their necks and arms. One of them glanced in their direction, and for a moment, Wallace thought they'd been spotted. Darnell muttered under his breath, "Stay cool." The man's gaze lingered before he turned back to his group, lighting a cigarette. Darnell motioned for Wallace to follow him into the community center. Inside, the air was musty, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the dimly lit room. A few people were gathered around a table, their faces lined with worry. Darnell, a woman, greeted him, relief evident in her tone. She was middle-aged, with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Glad you made it. We weren't sure if you'd be able to bring anything." "We've got what we could," Darnell said, setting his backpack on the table and pulling out the supplies. Wallace followed suit, though his movements felt clumsy compared to Darnell's efficiency. The people around the table began sorting through the items, their gratitude subdued but genuine. "Who's the new guy?" one of the men asked, eyeing Wallace with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Wallace," Darnell said simply. "He's here to help." The man raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Wallace could feel the weight of their judgment, the silent question of whether he was strong enough, brave enough, to be here. He wanted to prove himself, but he wasn't sure how. As they finished unloading the supplies, a young girl, no older than 7, tugged on Darnell's sleeve. "Mr. Darnell, there's someone outside," she whispered, her voice trembling. Darnell crouched to her level, his tone gentle but firm. "Did they see you?" She shook her head, her wide eyes glistening with fear. "I don't think so, but they're just standing there." Darnell stood, his expression hardening. "Stay here," he instructed the others before glancing at Wallace. "Come with me." Wallace hesitated but nodded, his stomach twisting with unease. As they stepped outside, the gray light of the overcast sky seemed even dimmer. Darnell scanned the street, his jaw tight. A figure stood at the end of the block, partially obscured by shadows. They were tall, their posture relaxed but somehow menacing. Darnell called out, his voice steady but commanding. "You looking for something?" The figure didn't respond immediately. They took a step forward, and Wallace could see them more clearly now. A man in his late 30s, dressed in a leather jacket and scuffed boots. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held a cold intensity that sent a shiver down Wallace's spine. "Word is you've been handing out supplies," the man said, his tone casual but edged with something darker. "That's bold, considering whose territory this is." Darnell didn't flinch. "We're just trying to help people survive." The man chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "Survive? Huh? Funny thing about that. You start stepping on the wrong toes, and survival gets a whole lot harder." Wallace's hands clenched at his sides. The tension was suffocating, and he felt completely out of his depth. Darnell, however, stood his ground, his voice unwavering. "We're not looking for trouble," he said, "but we're not backing down either." The man's smile faded, his expression turning cold. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts don't mean much when you're 6 feet under." Without another word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing ominously in the stillness. Wallace exhaled shakily, realizing he'd been holding his breath. "What was that about?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Darnell's gaze remained fixed on the man's retreating figure. "That was a warning," he said grimly. "And warnings like that don't come without consequences." Wallace felt a chill run down his spine. The stakes were higher than he'd imagined, and he was beginning to understand just how dangerous this world truly was. Whatever came next, he knew there was no turning back now. Darnell motioned for Wallace to follow him back inside the community center, his face set in a grim expression. The weight of the man's warning hung heavy in the air, and Wallace could feel the unease radiating from the others as they stepped back into the musty building. The young girl who had warned them earlier was still standing near the doorway, her small frame trembling as she clutched the edge of her sweater. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly, her eyes darting between Darnell and Wallace. Darnell forced a reassuring smile. "It's fine, sweetheart. Nothing to worry about." But Wallace could tell it wasn't fine. The tension in Darnell's voice, the way his eyes scanned the room even as he spoke, told a different story. He wasn't just worried. He was preparing for something. The people around the table exchanged uneasy glances. The woman who had greeted Darnell earlier stepped forward, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice low but firm. "Someone who doesn't want us here," Darnell replied. "But we're not leaving." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she glanced at the others. "You know what this means, don't you? If they're watching us, it's only a matter of time before they do more than send a warning." "We'll deal with it when it comes," Darnell said, his tone final. "For now, we keep doing what we came here to do." Wallace couldn't help but feel a surge of admiration for Darnell's resolve, even as his own nerves frayed at the edges. He had barely been here a day, and already he felt like he was in over his head. Yet, there was something about the way Darnell carried himself, unshakable, determined, that made Wallace want to stand beside him, no matter the danger. As the group resumed sorting through the supplies, Darnell pulled Wallace aside. "I need you to stay sharp," he said quietly. "Things might get ugly." Wallace nodded, though his heart pounded in his chest. "What do you think they'll do?" Darnell's jaw tightened. "Could be anything. Intimidation, vandalism, maybe worse. They don't like outsiders stepping into their territory, especially not to help people they've spent years keeping under their thumb." Wallace swallowed hard. "Why do they care so much?" "It's not like we're hurting anyone." Darnell's eyes darkened. "Power, Wallace. It's all about power. These people thrive on fear and control. When we come in here and show the community that they don't have to rely on them, that they can stand on their own, it threatens that control. And people like that don't let go of power without a fight." The weight of Darnell's words sank in, and Wallace felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced around the room, at the tired faces of the people they were helping. They didn't deserve this. None of them did. And yet, they were caught in the middle of a conflict they hadn't asked for. Before Wallace could respond, there was a loud crash outside. The sound reverberated through the building, causing everyone to freeze. The young girl gasped, clutching the woman's arm as the others exchanged nervous looks. Darnell was already moving toward the door, his movements swift but cautious. Wallace followed, his heart hammering in his chest. As they stepped outside, the scene that greeted them made his stomach drop. The group of men from earlier was back, and they hadn't come alone. There were at least 10 of them now, scattered across the street like wolves circling their prey. One of them held a metal pipe, which he had just used to smash the headlight of an old van parked nearby. Another was spray painting something on the side of the community center, the red letters dripping like blood. "Darnell," one of the men called out, his voice loud and mocking. "You really think you can play hero around here? You don't belong." Darnell stepped forward, his posture calm but unyielding. "We're not here to cause trouble," he said evenly. "We're here to help." The man sneered, tossing the pipe between his hands. "Help? That's funny. Because all I see is you sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Wallace's fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the anger bubbling inside him, but Darnell's hand on his shoulder stopped him from acting on it. "Stay cool," Darnell murmured under his breath. "They're trying to bait us." The man with the pipe took a step closer, his grin widening. "You got a lot of nerve, coming into our neighborhood and acting like you're in charge. But let me tell you something, Darnell. You don't run this place. We do. And if you don't pack up and leave, things are gonna get real messy." Darnell didn't flinch. "We're not going anywhere." The man's smile faded, replaced by a cold, menacing glare. "Suit yourself," he said. Then he raised the pipe and slammed it against the van again, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The tension was unbearable, the air crackling with the promise of violence. Wallace's mind raced, searching for a way to defuse the situation, but every option felt like a dead end. The men were outnumbered, outmatched, and facing a group that wouldn't hesitate to escalate. And yet, despite the odds, Darnell stood firm. His presence was a beacon of calm in the storm, a reminder that even in the face of fear, they couldn't back down. Wallace took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. If Darnell could face this, so could he. The men began to close in, their laughter and jeers growing louder. Wallace braced himself, every muscle in his body tensed. The group of men continued their slow, deliberate approach, their movements calculated to intimidate. The leader, the one with the pipe, stopped just a few feet from Darnell and Wallace, his grin twisting into something cruel. His companions flanked him like shadows, their eyes glinting with malice in the dim streetlight. "Last chance," the leader said, his voice low and dangerous. "You leave now, or we make you leave." Darnell's eyes didn't waver, his calm gaze locked on the man before him. "We're not leaving," he said firmly, his tone steady as a rock. "This community deserves better than what you've been giving them." The man's grin disappeared entirely. His knuckles whitened around the pipe, and for a moment, Wallace thought he was going to swing it. The tension was suffocating, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the streetlights overhead and the muffled sound of footsteps as the community center's occupants peered nervously from the windows. "You think you're some kind of savior?" the man sneered, stepping closer until he was nearly nose to nose with Darnell. "You don't know this place. You don't know these people. They don't need you. They need us." Wallace felt his pulse hammering in his ears, his fists clenching so tightly his nails bit into his palms. He wanted to step in, to say something, but he didn't trust himself to keep his cool. The weight of the situation bore down on him like a lead blanket, every instinct screaming at him to do something. But what? Any wrong move could escalate things beyond repair. Darnell didn't back down. "What they need," he said slowly, his voice carrying a quiet strength, "is freedom. A chance to live without fear. Without you." The man with the pipe didn't reply at first. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as if Darnell's words had struck a nerve. Then, without warning, he swung the pipe. Not at Darnell, but at the van again, the impact shattering the driver's side mirror and sending shards of glass scattering across the ground. "You want to play the hero?" the man spat, his voice rising. "Fine. Let's see how long you last when we're done with you." Behind him, the other men began to spread out, their movements deliberate and menacing. Wallace's breath caught as one of them reached into his pocket, pulling out a small switchblade with a metallic click. Another cracked his knuckles loudly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Darnell raised a hand, his palm facing outward, a gesture meant to calm, to de-escalate. "Look," he said evenly, "nobody here wants a fight. This doesn't have to go any further." But the leader just laughed, a cold, humorless sound that sent a chill down Wallace's spine. "Oh, it's going further," he said, "whether you want it to or not." Wallace's heart pounded as the situation teetered on the edge of chaos. He glanced toward the community center, where terrified faces were pressed against the windows. The young girl who had spoken earlier was clutching her mother's arm, her wide eyes filled with fear. Wallace felt a surge of anger and helplessness. They were trying to help these people, and now they were the ones in need of saving. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Wallace saw movement. At first, he thought it was one of the men circling around them, but then he realized it was coming from the far end of the street. A figure was approaching, their steps quick but purposeful. As they drew closer, the streetlight revealed an older man in a long coat, his face set in a grim expression. He carried himself with an air of quiet authority, and something about him made Wallace's tension ease, if only slightly. The leader of the gang noticed him too, his head snapping in the man's direction. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his tone laced with irritation. The older man didn't answer right away. Instead, he stopped a few feet away from the group, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. His gaze lingered on the shattered mirror, the spray-painted wall, the switchblade glinting in the dim light. "You boys really think this is the way to solve your problems?" he said finally, his voice calm but firm. The leader bristled. "Mind your own business, old man. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me when I see people terrorizing their own community," the man replied evenly. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. And it concerns me even more when I know who's behind it. The leader stiffened, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. You don't know anything, he snapped. But there was a crack in his bravado now, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. The older man's gaze didn't waver. I know enough. Enough to know you're not as untouchable as you think you are. Wallace exchanged a glance with Darnell, who gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. The arrival of this stranger had shifted the dynamic, the gang's confidence visibly shaken. But Wallace couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was far from over. The leader sneered, trying to regain his composure. You think you're scaring us? You're just some washed up. Before he could finish, the older man held up a hand. You can walk away now, he said, his tone quiet but commanding. Or you can keep pushing your luck. But I promise you, if you choose the latter, you won't like where it ends. For a moment, nobody moved. The street was so silent that Wallace could hear his own heartbeat. The tension was thick, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken threats and simmering rage. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The gang leader's eyes darted between Darnell, Wallace, and the older man who now stood unwavering before him. His grip on the pipe loosened slightly as the realization set in that the tide had shifted. The gang members exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence visibly eroding. The weight of the older man's calm but authoritative presence was suffocating. The leader let out a sharp breath, his voice laced with reluctant defeat. This isn't over, he muttered, tossing the pipe to the ground with a metallic clatter. With a motion to his crew, they began retreating, their steps unsteady and far less intimidating than before. The tension in the air finally began to dissipate, though the silence was now filled with an electric hum of relief. Wallace exhaled audibly, his shoulders dropping as he turned to Darnell. I thought for sure, he trailed off, shaking his head. Darnell stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the retreating figures until they disappeared into the shadows. His breath was steady, but the weight of what had just happened was visible on his face. He finally looked at Wallace, his expression a mixture of resolve and weariness. This isn't about us. It's about them, he said, gesturing toward the community center. The older man stepped forward, breaking the silence. You two handled yourselves well, he said, his voice carrying both approval and warning. But standing up to people like that takes more than courage. It takes persistence. His eyes softened as he continued, Don't stop what you're doing. These people need someone willing to fight for them. Darnell nodded, his respect for the stranger evident. Thank you for stepping in. Who are you? The man hesitated, then offered a small, almost wistful smile. Just someone who knows what it's like to see a community torn apart. Keep doing what's right. That's how you win in the end. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away, his figure vanishing into the same shadows from which he had emerged. Inside the community center, the atmosphere shifted. Slowly, people began stepping out, their faces cautious but curious. The young girl who had spoken earlier ran toward Darnell, clutching his hand. You're not leaving, are you? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Darnell knelt down, his hands resting on her small shoulders. No, he said firmly. We're staying. This is your home, and we'll do everything we can to make sure it's safe. The girl smiled, the first genuine smile Darnell had seen all night, and it was enough to reignite the fire within him. In the days that followed, word of the confrontation spread. The gang's influence began to wane as more people found the courage to stand up to them, inspired by Darnell and Wallace's defiance. The mural on the community center wall was repaired, and more hands joined to repaint it, this time with even more color, life, and meaning. Though the road ahead was far from easy, Darnell and Wallace realized that the battle they had faced wasn't just about the gang. It was about fear and the chains it placed on people. Slowly but surely, those chains were breaking. Darnell found himself changing too. He no longer carried the same self-doubt that had once plagued him. He had discovered something within himself, a strength he hadn't known existed, one fueled by purpose and the determination to protect and uplift others. Wallace, too, had grown, his impulsive tendencies tempered by a newfound sense of responsibility. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the neighborhood, Darnell and Wallace stood before the completed mural. The image depicted unity, a community standing together against the odds, vibrant and full of hope. Children laughed and played nearby, their voices carrying on the wind. "Think we made a difference?" Wallace asked, his tone thoughtful. Darnell smiled, the faintest hint of satisfaction in his eyes. "I think we started something. The rest is up to them." As they walked away, the mural behind them bathed in the last light of the day, it was clear that this was more than just a victory. It was a beginning, a chance for change, for healing, and for a brighter future. And that's the power of standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Sometimes, all it takes is one act of courage to inspire a ripple effect that transforms an entire community. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more inspiring and thought-provoking tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us for more. Let's continue to share stories that matter.